In this video, we're talking about theory hacks for better creativity. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I just want to give a heads up that this is a different style than you'll find on other videos on this channel. Typically, I like to produce pretty heavily edited content, and these are much more stripped down vlog style tutorials, a lot less cutting, because I really want to break down the process of making music in this 12 video series, taking you from beginner to pro. I would highly recommend, if you haven't seen the video intro on music theory that I gave earlier in this series, I highly recommend going back, checking that out first, and then coming to this one. It's going to give you the baseline for what we're going to be talking about today, especially learning the number system in music. That's really key. We're going to be referencing that a lot, so if that's a new concept for you, definitely recommend going back, watching that video, or watching another video on music theory, specifically the number system. But thanks for tuning in today. It'll probably be a little bit of a shorter video because we're just going over concepts and not actually making too much music. But we'll jump back to the studio as I'm driving home here, and we'll get into it. See you there. As you can see on my screen, I have a project open in Logic right now, going over the 3 tips that I have for music theory hacks. Tip number 1 is to one works with everything. Number 2 is to utilize tension, sustained 4, sustained 2nd, and the major 7th chords. And then my final tip is let the bass have the final word. I'm going to go much more in depth on what each of these means, and I also have a musical example of what I'm talking about. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So tip number 1, the 1 works with everything. So the 1 being the first chord in the scale that you're in. The key that I'm going to be in for this whole video is C major, just because it's the most simple key and easiest to teach from. If I come in here to my piano roll, right now I have chords in the key of C major, really simple chords. These are just fifths, so just the first and the 5th degree of each chord without the 3rd in between it. Right here we have an F 5th, which is a 4, then G 5th, which is the 5, then an E 5th, which is the 3, and then the A 5th, which is the 6. So our chord progression right now is 4, 5, 3, and then 6. Here's what it sounds like. So as you can hear, these chords are just a little bit stale. It's not quite professional. And so this tip, the 1 works with everything, really means that you can play the 1 chord on the top, and as long as the bass notes are still following the chord progression, it's gonna sound good. So here's a really simple example of this, where the bass notes are still playing the 4, 5, 3, 6, but on top you can see the 1 chord, the 1/5 is being sustained throughout. So listen to this. Already you're getting a much more complex sound that's really intriguing, interesting to listen to, and it sounds more unified because the chords aren't jumping all over the place. It's staying in a similar location, which is really nice. Of course, these chords aren't each exactly like this. This is technically an F9 or an F2 chord is what Logic is saying over here. And this chord isn't technically a G chord. It says it's a C5 chord, but what our brain hears that as is the same as if I play this. We hear the same sound. We're hearing that movement from the bass. So even though on paper it might not be the same exact chord necessarily, our brain is still perceiving it as the same chord but just has a better sound. That's how I think about it. Maybe that's not the right way to describe it, but hopefully it can help you a little bit. Tip number 2, utilize tension through sustained 4 chords, sustained 2nd chords, and major 7th chords. Tension is everything in music. Music is all about building and releasing tension. One great way to build tension at the fundamental level is through your chords. And some great chords that I prefer and love to use to achieve tension is the sustained 2nd, sustained 4th chords, and major 7th chords. What are they? It's adding 1 note to a basic chord is what each one of these chords is doing. And I have examples of all these using the same chord progression right here. So right here we have an F chord. These bottom two notes are F and C, which are normal notes in a F chord. And then on top we have an E, which is an abnormal note in the F chord. All together makes a chord called an F major seventh. It sounds a little bit different than if we just play a F5. It's got a way different feel to it. So this is a G sustained fourth chord, and the abnormal note in this chord would be the C right here. Typically G would just have the three notes in it. If we start on our G, we move up, we skip a note in the scale, go up to B, and then go up to C. That would make our G major chord. Sounds good, sounds very normal. But when we move the third up to a fourth, we get this nice tension. I don't have a sustained second chord in here, but really all that would be is like a normal C chord, for example. C, E, G, but the third would be just moved down to a second. So it'd be C, D, and G. Again, you can hear the tension in that. So using these chords all together, back to back, does build up a lot of tension in a chord progression, as you can hear. You can hear that there's, in each one of these chords, on the theory side, there's no complete resolution of there being a standard chord that you're waiting for. And so because of this, that actually builds tension in your brain because your brain's waiting for that release of the one major chord. Here's a little example where we combine the past two steps. The one works with everything and utilizing tension in our chords. So we have the same chord progression, and on top we just have a G and a C sustained, which sounds good together. By layering together these two steps, we're creating a more textured chord than we originally started out with. On to the last tip in this tutorial, which is to let the bass have the final word. In every chord structure, the bass is always what's going to be setting the foundation for the rest of the chord, and even though it takes a little bit more of a trained ear to hear what the bass is playing specifically, ultimately what you're going to feel from the music is the note that the bass is playing. And so oftentimes when I'm making music, I like to start out with simple chord progression, build that. For example, here's our chord progression from earlier down here. As you can see, we're playing really simple chords. We're using trick number 1 and playing the 5 on top of everything. And underneath that, the bass notes in this pad are playing the 4, 5, 3, 6, C major. Same chord progression as we had before. But what we're going to do now is we're going to create a separate bass track, and we're going to add bass notes that complement the chords that this pad is playing, but change the fundamental chord. So if I paste these into our pad track, the notes match on one of the chords, but for every other of the chords, the notes are playing a couple degrees lower, which shifts the whole chord. What your brain is going to hear is the 2. It's going to hear the minor 2 chord, the major 5 chord, and then it's going to hear the 1 chord, and then it's going to hear the 4 chord. So if I take this off and I unmute the bass, you're going to hear what I'm talking about. You can feel that it shifts the mood. It's adding complexity to the chords. So if I mute the bass, it's against the 4, 5, 3, 6, 2, 5, 1, 4. So just by adding bass notes a few degrees below our initial chords, we're completely changing how our mind is perceiving the chords and the mood of the structure that we're just doing. I hope all of these tips were helpful for you, and if it did help you in any kind of way, feel free to let me know in the comments. Give this video a thumbs up, promotes it to more people in the algorithm, and that gets my channel to people like you who love music. Feel free to subscribe. See you next week. Peace.